hppodcraft.com.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast. I'm Chad Pfeiffer.
And I'm Chris Lackey. We're here at hppodcraft.com, and this is our free show for the month of June.
Please consider joining us on Patreon, where we cover a story in the weird fiction tradition every week. And next month, we'll be extending that reach to include more science fiction and fantasy, as well as all sorts of disquieting literary fiction as strange studies of strange stories.
But this week, we are joined by a guest. He is the author of over 35 novels and countless short stories in the horror genre. Ladies and gentlemen, Ramsey Campbell. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks guys. Thank you for having me.
We're so grateful that you've taken the time to speak with us. You've actually been guiding the content of the show for the last month, as the stories we covered were all from your late 80s anthology Fine Frights. Stories that scared me, which as promised made us both wet our pants. Actually made us wet each other's pants, so extremely effective.
And this month, we're covering a couple of tales from the Folio Book of Horror Stories, which is a beautiful book illustrated by Corey Brickley that you've edited and is available now from the Folio Society, and we'll link out to that in the show notes.
Yeah, we're doing Brenda and The Bus by Shirley Jackson from that book.
Okay.
Both are incredible stories. And we've got a ton of questions, but I'm going to go ahead and jump in on something specific, having just read this stuff. We've been doing this show for 13 years this month, starting with Lovecraft's fiction and then reading through the work of his influences and those he influenced, as well as a number of tangentially related stories in the horror field. And after 600 or so of these, one begins to feel like, I've seen all the ways into a horror story. 98% are inherited mansions. But two stories we've covered from Fine Frights last month, Child's Play by Villy Sorensen,
Yes.
and Lost Memory by Peter Phillips. They gave me that rush of novelty because both stories involved the horrors of limited perspective. Characters that think they're doing the right thing, maybe, but are just missing some kind of crucial understanding.
Yeah.
In both stories, it's misunderstanding how the human body works based on limited information that the characters are very confident in. These stories kicked off your anthology, Fine Frights, and I wondered what attracted you to that specific theme of within the horror genre.
Well, it wasn't so much that, it was just that those stories had stuck so strongly in my mind. Now, I have to tell you this. I first read Child's Play when I was the age of the kids in the story.
Oh, my God.
Wow.
So it was kind of a baptism of fire. Because my mother was allowing me to take adult stuff out from the local public library on her ticket. And if it was in the library in hardcover, it was respectable. So little did she know, quite obviously in this case. Because in those days, of course, there was no horror section. It was just the fiction, Fiction was just in the alphabetical order of author on the shelf. So, and for me, this was part of the excitement of belonging to a library, the whole business of finding the unexpected. And, occasionally I'd take something off the shelf, only to realize it was not what it sounded like, put it back again. So, Georges du Maurier's novel, The Martian, it is apparently, in a way, a kind of science fiction fantasy, but it didn't seem very much like one to me at the age of 8 or whatever it was.
Sure.
I refiled it. However, the Sorensen book was introduced by Angus Wilson, no less, was a major British literary figure at that time. It was called Strange Stories. So I thought, well, this has got to be the sort of thing I'd like. And I duly took it out. And obviously the librarian who stamped it out did not notice the kind of thing the 10-year-old me was taking away. And funny enough, the only book she ever said, no, you mustn't have that, was Gogol's Dead Souls.
Oh.
I don't know why that was regarded as being forbidden, but it was. So that was the one that got stopped at the counter.
Oh, you must have wanted to read it more than anything at that point then.
Well, yes, of course I did, yeah. It was years before I got to it. However, the Sorensen starts off with Child's Play, and it was one of the stories, and we'll get to another later on in our talk, I suspect, but it was one of the very first stories I remember reading and thinking, basically, I mustn't let my mother see I'm reading this, because by God, she's not going to like this at all. And it deeply troubled me, of course, as you can well imagine.
Yeah. Stuck
in my mind. Decades later, I realized when I was going to edit Fine Frights, which incidentally I'll explain the title in a moment too. I realized nobody's heard of this. Nobody knows Sorensen anymore. Although there was a second collection published by, I think it was an American University Press in translation.
Very difficult to find.
Even
now.
Indeed. It's always been my ploy with doing reprint anthologies. I want to put stuff in there that I hope even the aficionado will not know. And that was one I thought, yeah, pretty certainly people will not know this. And seems like I was right.
You were. Yeah.
I mean, I still find that story deeply disturbing. And as you say, it's a classic incident, well, not of the unreliable narrator, but the unreliable protagonist, because, they think they know what they're doing, and by gum, do they not? And how horrendous the consequences of this are. Well, only those who've read the tale will know, and obviously the people who are listening who don't know, I'm sure we exhort them to go and find out immediately, or as soon as we finish this program.
That's right.
You were young. It's blowing my mind. My son is 7, almost 8 years old. And to think that he would be reading Lovecraft, it seems an impossibility.
Yes.
That he would ever consider reading that stuff. Even when I didn't discover Lovecraft until I was 13 or 14 years old. And I thought it was a little unwieldy at times, just with his kind of antiquated vocabulary and the structure of his stories. But how did you discover? I mean, I assume you just found him at the library.
Exactly.
But what was it about his books that made you keep reading them?
Only a single story, actually, because in those days you couldn't get a complete collection of Lovecraft in Britain. There had been one from Gollancz, actually, in the I think early to mid 50s. Steve Jones has a very good little book on Lovecraft in Britain, actually, which is worth tracking down. So it gives you a lot of the publishing history. But Gollancz had done The Haunter of the Dark, as I remember it, which is a selection of.
Yeah.
But that was way out of print by well, no, actually it wouldn't have been that long out of print. But it wasn't. It was certainly available in that library, and I didn't know of its existence. Otherwise, I would have ordered it. And so I was only really coming on his stories in anthologies, mainly Dearth anthologies. Dearth would slip a Lovecraft tale into science fiction, so you'd have, but there were minor things like Beyond the Wall of Sleep or From Beyond. Good, but not the best. But there was a Groff Compton anthology called Strange Travels in Science Fiction, came out in '54 in Britain, and that was the one I found when I was 8, and that had The Colour Out of Space. And by gum, that was the other story I was referring to, where again, I thought I actually I'd already read M.R. James, and E.F. Benson, people like this, and had many a sleepless night after doing that. But reading The Colour Out of Space was somehow different. It was on a different level. It actually felt almost forbidden. There was again this sense of, I don't want to be seen reading this because it'll be taken away from me as being too much, Yeah. And indeed it was pretty close to the edge of too much when I read it. But I found it hugely powerful, which of course it is. I think on the whole it's still my favourite Lovecraft story, although there's certainly some contenders. But I think that's the one that does that sense of the cosmic more completely than any of the other stories for me. There's just a sense of something which he never describes as indescribable. I mean, that's that cliche notion of what Lovecraft does. He very rarely does that at all. He conveys it indirectly, but that's a completely different thing. But I think that the entire story kind of plays as a metaphor for the utterly alien. It was just a car out of space, but that's all you need. It's the perfect symbol. At the same time, got to be on a very visceral level as well. I remember the who is it now? It's the narrator within the narration who picks up the stick, when he's gone up to see this crumbling person, and leaves the stick when he's done. And we're not told what he's done, but by God, at 8 years old, I knew perfectly well, and it, it was deeply disturbing to me.
So you were 8 when you read The Colour Out of Space?
Yeah.
I'm so horrified.
And horrifying story. I thought about it actually in the context of Child's Play, because The Colour Out of Space is again involving something that we just can't understand.
Yes, that's right.
And did we cause this? Because, I was watching the 1950s War of the Worlds where a similar thing happens. Here's a meteorite. Let's just go hit it with a hammer.
Yes, that's right.
See what happens. In The Colour Out of Space, we never really get to know Is it the color? Is it something that seeped into the ground? What is this alien presence? It's beyond our human senses. And I think that what a great introduction to Lovecraft, because that is the cosmic horror. And then also we have the degrading bodies that are falling apart, which I was thinking about a bit as I just read Brenda by Margaret St. Clair, that's included in the Folio Book of Horror. And I thought about that in relation to your story Down There, which I also read recently, which is another shambling, sort of devolving human form. We can get to that stuff in a bit, but I wanted to say we try to popularize weird fiction, find stories and authors that maybe aren't so well known, much as you're trying to do with these anthologies. And we always ask everybody, when did they start reading Lovecraft here? But I wonder, when did you find yourself first sharing good stories with others? Obviously, you felt... It's funny because when I was reading The Case of Charles Dexter Ward was the first thing I read, and part of the thing about that purple prose that was nice is I felt like it protected me. If my parents were to pick that up, they'd go, this is just a bunch of gobbledygook. This is Shakespeare stuff that this kid's in, and they wouldn't see what it was really about. But when did you find yourself first sharing good stories with others, or making recommendations, or clicking into a community of folks that might be interested in that knowledge?
Gosh, well, let me think. I suppose it was when I was at school to begin with, and probably what we call grammar school in Britain, which is a fee-paying high school. But one friend, a particular guy, Kevin Bulger, who sadly I've lost touch with. So if you're listening to this, Kevin, drop me an email or a Facebook message or something. I used to pass on particularly Lovecraft to him, and Frank Long. I remember interestingly enough, I remember Kevin felt that Long was much sparer than Lovecraft. The style didn't really work as well because, in his view, Long would just tell you, whereas Lovecraft would, kind of orchestrate the prose, as Fritz Leiber put it, really, which of course he does do. So, Kevin was particularly the guy I'd pass books on to when I read them, and then. In my early teens, though, I joined the British Science Fiction Association, and then started corresponding with other folk. Got into fandom through the letter pages and so forth. And again, one friend in particular, Pat Kearney, who is now has written a considerable number of bibliographical studies, particularly of erotica. Actually, he was a historian of the Olympia Press, for instance. But Pat and I got together as correspondents originally via the postal library of the British Science Fiction Association, because we were the only two guys taking out issues of Weird Tales. So Peter Maybe, who was the librarian there, he put us together via correspondence, and we became friends. And in fact, it was Pat who having learned that I was writing Lovecraft pastiches, encouraged me to send them off to August Derleth for an opinion. And the rest we know, as they say.
So I was curious about what that landscape was like, and you're explaining it, really, that you were in a science fiction club, and that through correspondence you sort of met these other people and shared these stories, and they encouraged you to send stuff to August Derleth. And you worked with August Derleth. Did you ever meet him in person? No,
sadly, never did. No, I mean, he died years before I first went to America, which is one of my great regrets, But we corresponded for 10 years. I don't know if you've seen this. There is a PS Publishing collection of all of our extant correspondence called Letters to Arkham, which will shows you our kind of developing relationship, not merely as writer and mentor, because just as Lovecraft was Derleth's mentor, Derleth was mine. In fact, it's extraordinary when you read their letters and then our letters, how similar some of the correspondence is in a way,
Wow.
So you basically get, young Derleth saying what I did when I was 15, and then, Derleth, the mature Derleth, saying stuff to me as Lovecraft did to him when he was a young, aspiring writer. So I have a very strong sense of continuity, and I've kind of tried to pass that on me too, to help new writers as best I can as well.
We've covered a lot of Lovecraft pastiches on on the show, from Robert Bloch and Derleth himself. And even Stephen King did his Lovecraft pastiche with Jerusalem's Lot. It seems like a sort of rite of passage for horror writers.
Yeah, Crouch End, yeah.
I'm a big fan of Alone with the Horrors. Chris, I think that's what you've been reading, right?
Yeah.
Recently, which covers your short fiction from 61 to 91. The additional benefit or value add to that, aside from the great stories, that they're included chronologically.
Yes.
And we can watch your style evolve from those Lovecraftian affectations to something that's uniquely yours. I do think, speaking of young writers, a lot of young potential writers, they'll put down the pen because they feel that they're imitating their heroes or they're just treading ground that's been tread before. Yeah. But clearly there's some value in this.
Oh, yes, gosh, I think so. It's not because I think it seems to me like it's mainly in writing fiction that people, are a bit wary of imitation. But I mean, the thing I always cite, is music. I mean, early Beethoven sounds like Haydn, but he also learned from Mozart, and early Wagner sounds like Beethoven. Richard Strauss sounds like Wagner. But you would never mistake one for the other once they hit their stride. And I think the same is true with writing, really.
Well, Lovecraft himself talked about having his Poe stories and his Dunsany stories.
Yeah.
Where are my stories? Where's my voice?
Well, we could see it even if he couldn't. That's the irony, isn't it?
Yeah. So what does it mean to be a mythos writer? I think that your work transcends that classification, but when I first heard your name mentioned, they were saying, oh yeah, he's a mythos writer.
Sure.
That label did initially get me to read your work.
Well, to be honest, I'm happy to be called it. I think kind of invented my own little corner of it. I've now tended to call the Bitchester mythos because, there's these various creatures that hang around in the Severn Valley in England. Partly because, Derleth said, don't use Massachusetts, invent your own milieu, which I duly did.
Yeah.
But I've very much come back to this. I did this trilogy recently, and that's it's basically me going back to those concepts that I had in my mid-teens, really. Glacke and Daleoff and friends, trying to do right by them, because it seemed to me I wasn't technically equipped back then to do them justice. But now, I just like to give them another whirl, basically. But the other thing that's so extraordinary, you asked what it means to be a mythos writer. What it seems to mean is that these things go away from you, just as they did with Lovecraft, obviously, and take on this extraordinary kind of life of their own, and so they're out there in the world. Nothing I can do about it now. They're out there, guys. I can't call them back, and so you've got people using them as Twitter handles and Facebook profiles.
Sure.
Heavy metal bands are doing songs about them, and people are an amazing amount of art out there, based on them. Astonishing, some great stuff. I'll tell you what it feels like. It feels like being Victor Frankenstein. And your monsters have gone off, and you can't stop them now. There's nothing you can do about them now. They've taken on their own monstrous life.
Yeah, but I think that must feel pretty good in a way. That you've created something that already is going to live beyond you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. So the world may thank me or it may curse me, but it's beyond me now.
But you'll be out there on the Arctic at the end, chasing that monster down. I really enjoyed. We also covered the horror at Chilton Castle, which was the Joseph Payne Brennan story. We loved Brennan's Slime that we covered, I think, last year or the year before. But I liked your forward to it, where you directed your focus on his ability to enliven what would be a predictable sort of weird tales story with his economical and careful writing style, which I think he shares that in common with Margaret St. Clair, who wrote Brenda, also has a very clear non-purple prose style.
Yes.
Who are some writers outside of horror fiction, maybe, that have shaped how you put your text to page, aside from Lovecraft?
Oh, well, outside the field, one single above all was absolute. Just as reading Lovecraft when I was 14, a complete book of his, was what really steeped me in him and made me want to do this stuff, that started me off imitating. But, strange enough, it was almost immediately after I finished writing that first collection, The Inhabitant of the Lake. I was just turning 17, and I happened upon it was on a station bookstall, a copy of Low Lolita. And that was an absolute epiphany of what you could do with language, this sort of extraordinary kind of relish of language, but, what you could do with narrative, how you could come up your themes obliquely and, basically write a comic novel about the most unlikely and theoretically, unwelcoming subject. Because, among other things, it was a very funny book. It's also a highly disturbing book, quite obviously. Yeah. But it was just an utter revelation to me. And let me confess, I was 17, just going on 17. And one of the reasons I bought it was it was supposedly a naughty book, But I only read the first few pages, I thought, this is so much more. Once I finished it, I got hold of everything else by Nabokov I should get my hands on. And as great luck would have it, Pale Fire came out almost immediately after it, which funnily enough, I'm rereading right now. I hadn't reread it since I originally did, good God, more than 50 years ago. It's just as astounding now as it was to me then. But what kind of disconcerts me is I now realize just how much I learned from it that I'd forgotten from Pale Fire. There are echoes of that in various things I've written since, in terms of particularly, if you like, not so much the unreliable narrator as the inadvertent narrator. The narrator is telling you stuff he doesn't realize he's revealing. That's crucial to Pale Fire. It's also crucial to a whole lot of stuff I've written, and I now see how much of a debt I owe.
It's funny, the little themes coming up here in the show, because I didn't read Lolita until I was much older. I would think I was in my 30s, but I was reading it, commuting to a job on a bus, and I kept feeling like I was doing something wrong, like I was going to get in trouble.
Yeah. No, I'm completely barefaced about these things now. I read Dessard on the train, the hell with
it. Recently, I've discovered Robert Aikman's work, and that's how we had Jeremy on the show, Jeremy Dyson, because he did that great mini documentary on Radio 3 or Radio 4 about Aikman. We were able to talk to him about Aikman because he knows so much about the fella. I know that you read Aikman as well. How did you discover his work?
Oh, in a paperback of Dark Entries way back in, 63 or 64, I think it would have been. I remember recommending him to Derleth, actually, saying, here's a British writer you probably haven't heard of and you must read. So I duly bought a spare of Dark Entries and sent it over to him, and he was pretty well taken with it. He then approached Aikman for a story, Travellers by Night, and the original story that Derleth said, I don't know which one Robert sent him, but it was Derleth regarded as being not that supernatural. So he asked him to do another one. He did the Cicerones, and of course he did buy that. And funny, of course, Jeremy, you remember, Jeremy and Mark Gatiss did a film of that, which
they did,
which is very good. Sadly, there was the notion of Arkham doing, a best of Aikman collection, but they couldn't come to terms, so that never came to fruition. So, but as I said, but to go back to your original question, no, it was going to Dark Entries in paperback. This was again another revelation. One of my favourite films then and now is Last Year in Marienbad, and one of the things that confirms to me, an enigma can be more satisfying than any solution. Yeah. And I found this very much with Aikman too. So again, I duly got everything else I could find as they came out. And we actually did become correspondents and eventually friends, Aikman and I, and he came to stay with Jenny and me back when we had our first house in Liverpool for a weekend.
Wow.
We had a variously memorable time. Robert was a man of strong opinions, let's put it that way.
Yeah. I'm just curious what kind of guy he was or what he was like to hang out with.
He was a tremendous conversationalist. And Hugh Lamb, the anthologist, again, sadly, two men no longer with us, but Hugh made the very perspicacious comment that Robert would, in conversation, Robert would remind you how much you knew. He was very good at drawing you out, and even if he didn't agree. I'm sure there were people with whom he had tremendous confrontations, but never with us. He was very genial, and even when we disagreed, it would be a genial, sort of amused disagreement. Because for instance, some of these were just very, very friendly disagreements. We'd be disagreeing about what was the best Arthur Machen story, what was the best Algernon Blackwood story.
Sure.
In each case, we too had different views. but sometimes his views were a whole lot stronger. He absolutely detested the film Don't Look Now, for instance, in every possible way, you know.
Is that right?
Yes, yes. Oh, we are.
Oh, wow. We were just talking about that movie yesterday, Chris.
Yes, we were. Yeah, because I just watched the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and we had seen that. What we're talking about, 70s Donald Sutherland.
The subgenre of seedy feeling Donald Sutherland films, and which those two fall into.
That's right. Well, you see, he loved Donald Sutherland. He scoffed at Sutherland's accent, which he apparently, I think he found somehow fake. It's not obvious. It's a genuine accent, but there you go. Robert was not persuaded.
Wow. Awesome. I didn't think we'd get a Robert Aikman, Donald Sutherland rivalry on this show ever. And I've been spoiling for it for a long time. I just read your story, Just Waiting, from Alone with the Horrors, and that had a very Aikman-type feel, I thought, in that there were some unresolved questions in it, but also there were horrific waiters, I guess, is what really it was like in the hospice.
Well, yes, of course. Now, you see, that's an odd case. I mean, I had not written a short story for 3 years. Which is not to say I haven't written anything, but the previous 3 years had actually been taken with novels. And the most ambitious up to that book, which was Incarnate, and that took me 18 months, you see, and so there wasn't really room. I remember I went off with Jenny and I, and the kids then young, we went off for a Sunday picnic in one of the forests nearby, Delamere Forest, which has lots of picnic tables. And we were just sitting at the table now, and I all of a sudden this came to me, and I just kind of told the story, the basic story, to the family. This whole idea of waiters coming out of the woods to serve us, and they've got bare feet, and that's the first really.
That was unsettling. Why do they have bare feet? Yeah, very well done.
Yeah, well, that was.
You told this story to your family? That must have been an.
Well, they were used to it by then. I used to come up with this stuff. Another one around the same area was completely unrelated, just came to me out of the air, was there's a story of mine called The Guide, which is a kind of M.R. James tribute. And there's a paragraph in there which goes something like, imagine a spider in human form with only 4 limbs, a spider both enraged and made ungainly by the loss, particularly since the remaining limbs are by no means evenly distributed. And that whole sentence just came to me out of the air, or possibly out of a certain amount of minor hallucinogenic self-indulgence. But that's a story. That's a story for another episode.
Wow!
I wrote that down, and of course I thought, well, I've got to do something with this. And when I was asked to do a story for an anthology of kind of traditional ghost stories, I thought, well, okay, let's incorporate that and somehow make it by M.R. James within the story, and that's where that whole thing came from. But initially it came out of a woodland walk.
Do you often stop with the short fiction while you're writing a longer piece like a novel?
Oh, always. I won't ever write more than one piece of fiction at a time. So while I'm doing a new first draft of one thing, nothing else. I'll work on other things, but I won't actually write a new story or more than one at a time.
On the show, we talk a lot there are the things we take very seriously, and then there are sort of pulpy or maybe poorly written or stories with big ideas that don't quite stick the landing that we still love to discuss. And for example, in our bonus episodes, we cover episodes of the television show Manimal because we find that very entertaining. What are some ridiculous stories or movies that you like, things that are flawed or maybe even stupid, but you love them anyway?
Well, I mean, one of the greatest films of all time, and I'll brook no argument from anybody on this, is Plan 9 from Outer Space, which is
of course,
absolutely inexhaustible.
Absolutely.
And I don't think it's a guilty pleasure. I think it's a great pleasure. Jenny and I'll watch that anytime, and not quite as fine, but still Bride of the Monster, is very extraordinary. Glenn Glenda, I mean, Ed Wood, generally speaking. And it's precisely that absolute earnestness, I think, that you sense.
Yes.
Yes,
He's
absolutely.
not setting this up. He's genuinely, trying to do the best he possibly can, getting it wrong in so many different ways.
Oh yeah, you talking about the character accidentally revealing themselves. He's got a book called Hollywood Rat Race that is Ed Wood's How to Make It in Hollywood, and he's sort of posing as being this accomplished producer, which to an extent he is. I mean, he got those movies made, but he reveals things about his own life accidentally, like here's a good place to sleep in Griffith Park, and here's how you can trick people into thinking you have your own phone. So you get a sense of his poverty and the life he's actually dealing with almost accidentally, and it's in line with the rest of his work as being so in earnest, but just missing the mark a little bit, which is kind of my favorite genre of things.
I mean, I've said more than a little bit, but you're being obviously very kind-hearted. But no, I think he misses the mark inventively.
Yes,
without cease, basically. The thing is, I can always find something new when I go back to Brown. Now there's always something I didn't know. Just inexhaustible, as far as I'm concerned.
You're right. I mean, it took a long time for me to realize that Bella must have been naked under that cape for the whole movie, because when the thing hits him and they find the skeleton, it still has the cape on. So that means that this thing didn't affect fabric, which means the whole time he's lurking around, or his chiropractor double, he's naked under that cape.
Having said that, there's many a werewolf who's about to not merely subsume the suit they're wearing, but reproduce it when they turn back into human. I don't know.
Right.
And again, let me point this out to you, which is it's an absolutely great film without any question whatsoever. I'm not about to piddle on it, but I mean, King Kong to my mind is the greatest monster of all time, really. But there is one thing it has in common with The Amazing Colossal Man, or actually War of the Colossal Beast, which is the sequel to The Amazing Colossal Man. You ever notice these giant guys, they hop because they only leave one footprint.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a great moment in War of the Colossal Beast where the poor old Colossal Man's sister, I think it's his sister, isn't it? I think, has now been roped into the search party by the scientists. And one of the scientists, they find this footprint, and the scientist, one of them says very gravely, judging from this footprint, the man who made it must be 85 feet tall. To which our heroine says, my brother is 85 feet tall. Presumably came from his cousin who is only 84 and a half. I don't know. They need that identification.
Also, nobody concludes, and he's only got one leg.
Well, that's right.
Clearly.
Right.
To bring it back to sort of Lovecraftian creepy stuff, cosmic horror, what does it mean to you, and what do you think is its appeal?
Oh, for me, it's a kind of sense of awe, a sense of reaching for something larger than you can actually directly show. Just the sense of the wonders of the universe, if you like. So, I mean, I think Fritz Leiber had it right, as so often Fritz did, It's a sort of combination of wonder and terror, really. That's what does it, really, for me. And, you can find it in Lovecraft, but you also found it, I think, in, Olaf Stapledon, who was writing, science fiction that was not overtly horrific, but again there's a sense of real terror, I think, as the canvas gets larger and larger in something like Star Maker. He touches on the love. I can't know, you may perhaps recall this, did Lovecraft read Stapleton? I think he did, actually.
I'm not sure.
Along the way. And I think he praised him, yeah. So I think they have more in common, for instance, than is often acknowledged. That, for me, is the real appeal of that. I think, you find it in something like The Willows, the Algernon Blackwood, which I should explain. I didn't include, I would have loved to include that in the folio book.
Yeah.
The reason I did was sheer just reasons of space, and there was a limit to the number of stories of that length that I could include. I wasn't going to be done out of The White People, which is possibly my all-time favourite horror story, so that had to go in. I had to have something by Steve King, because that would have been incomplete otherwise. But, when I realised, a lot of his stories are really pretty long. a lot of the best ones. So,
Yeah.
I really wanted 1408. So the Blackwood I used is Ancient Light, but I think that's a real distillation of Blackwood. It's not the usual style, but his genius shines through it all the same, even though it's just an 8-page story. So that was my sort of a compromise there.
Well, I've read Stephen King mentions you in Dance Macabre, doesn't he?
He does. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because in fact we had met when he came to England first time he came over. He got the publishers to track me and also Jim Herbert down because he wanted to just to get together, really, But eventually, I don't know if he already had Dance Macabre in mind. Maybe not. Maybe just making friends in the genre. I think probably more than anything else. But obviously, he did write us up, both of us, in Dance Macabre, and I imagine he must have done this with Jim. He certainly rang me up from Maine. We had a long talk over the phone about about my stuff, which much of which he then incorporated in that chapter.
You say The White People is your favorite Mackin story.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
To go back to an earlier theme, when I was reading Brenda, and it was the female protagonist dealing with this sort of malformed, slimy, de-evolving man.
Yes.
And then Down There, your story, also a woman trapped in a building with strange primordial creatures below. Sorry to tip the plot. But we also recently covered Fat Face by Michael Shea with our guest Patton Oswalt. And that, again, is a Shoggoth-like gelatinous fellow versus a woman as the main character.
Yes,
and
right.
The White People has a little to do with this as well, where it's the young girl's initiation into, we think, a cult or some sort of pagan ritual.
Yes.
What do you think is the relationship between the sort of de-evolving man and as a concept in general, and then why are we approaching it with these female characters?
I have no idea. I mean, it never occurred to me before. You're absolutely right. It's a very sort of intriguing kind of set of symbols, isn't it? And honestly, again, because actually extending it a little bit further in Mackin, of course, you do often have this sense of physical breakdown, not in that story particularly, but most certainly in the Great God Pan.
Right.
And the black seal, actually, and the white powder.
The white powder is what I was trying to think of, because they actually depict a sort of melting mass of people in that as well.
That's right. So it's very much a recurrent theme. But I mean, it's a return to the primordial. It's difficult to know. In the St. Clair, you see, would we see it as being some sort of symbol of on the one of the devolution of the male and the ascendance of the female? Because Margaret Sinclair was certainly into magic and paganism, and she I mean, that comes over very strongly in some of her later work. But she did interested in, and I think to some extent practiced, some forms of magic. She and her husband. So I think these underlie her fiction. There may be more symbolism in there than is apparent to somebody not as well tutored in it as I am. Mackin was, of course, a member, like Blackwood, for a while of the Order of the Golden Dawn. So they would certainly have some magical knowledge. To what extent they put it into practice doesn't matter. But it's hardly surprising if it rises up in some form in their fiction.
Absolutely. Yeah. Who are some short story writers that maybe we should look at going forward who maybe haven't gotten much exposure that you are a fan of or think that more people should be reading? It can be current or hopefully from the past.
Well, obviously, there are a lot that I think we could now assume that the greats are well known by most. Well, let me think of a few. I mean, for instance, L.P. Hartley, you see, isn't necessarily associated that much with the field. Most people maybe think of The Go-Between as largely because of a very fine Losi film based on it. But Hartley wrote several dozen supernatural horror stories, and there's at least one collection of them. Although you could equally well get his collected short stories and find a lot of other things in there as well. Because actually, this is a crucial thing. I think that back then more so than now, although perhaps it's coming back again, supernatural horror and the macabre were not particularly regarded as being separate from literature. They were just part of the mainstream, if you like. And it was by no means unusual for short story writers just to include some stories of this kind in their collections of a more general fiction. So you have this with Hartley. You have it with W. Jacobs, again, probably crucially fated for The Monkey's Paw. But he wrote at least a book's worth of supernatural horror stories and macabre stories. Again, you can get a collection of them now, because back then in his time, they were scattered through his collections. Elizabeth Bowen, you would certainly find very rewarding in similar terms. Graham Greene wrote only a few, but they're powerful stories. Little Place on the Edge, Little Place Off the Edgware Road is probably the most striking and certainly the most macabre. One who's coming back into print very, very soon now is Nigel Neal. Now, the name ring a bell for the Quatermass films, maybe.
Oh, okay.
I hope so. He was a tremendous talent, and he had a real Lovecraftian sense of melding the supernatural and the scientific and taking them forward into something new. But his original collection called Tomato Cain as in Cain and Abel, from the late 40s. It's a lot of macabre fiction and some are overtly supernatural, which has the seeds of his Quatermass developments in there, and that is being reprinted very soon now in Britain by Comma Press, and I exhort people to track that one down. And I since you brought up Margaret Sinclair, let me just say that I edited a collection of her best for Dover Books a couple of years back, and that's still well in print, and I would send folk out to grab that because it really is. They've got some very striking stuff in it.
We'll be covering that story next week, and so
okay.
I'm very interested in reading more of her work. I thought Brenda was excellent.
And as for now, well, there are so many. Oh Lord, you see, when I get asked this question, I always get this panic because I know as soon as we're off the air, I'm going to say, oh God, I should have I should have mentioned so and so and them as well, and those to boot.
Well, that's why we don't cover living artists on our podcast, because we're afraid we're going to upset somebody.
Yes, that's it. But I mean, all I will just say is this: there's so much talent out there now that I would not. It would take me more than this entire program to,
of course,
probably even to name them. Never mind do them justice. So I would say basically check out Ellen Datlow's best horror anthologies and Steve Jones, although he's now come to the end of them, but he did 31 anthologies of best horror of the year, best new horror, and those will give you enormous numbers of writers to follow up. And I endorse his taste.
Well, I'm so glad that you continue to identify as a horror author, despite being best-selling and successful and writing all these books and winning all these awards, that you are not running away from it once you've had your success with the thrills and chills.
No, I write horror. That's what I say.
I find that there's just as much in horror literature to uncover and learn about as there are in any genre. And I think when you're mentioning that most writers at a certain time period would have written one or two horror ghost stories, I think that's because it's part of the human experience and needs to be articulated. And I'm so grateful for all of your work and for continuing to champion the fiction of others. It's a great benefit to us as a culture to have you kicking around, Ramsey.
Well, I do my best.
What have you got coming up, Ramsey? Anything that you can tell us about?
Well, the trilogy is now out in mass market. All three books of them are there. There's a new cosmic horror novel of mine coming out in September from Flame Tree Press called Fellstones, one word, Fellstones, which is the name of an English village and also the ancient monument at the centre of the village that gives it its name, and which is, I'm sure you won't need me to tell you this, has a certain cosmic significance which becomes increasingly apparent as the book goes on. And, well, let me try and shock you with a final revelation.
Okay.
Because the other book I'm working on now, and pretty close to completion, but whenever I think I've finished it, something else comes up and I have to incorporate it. But I've now done about 70,000 words of a monograph about the Three Stooges.
No way! Oh my gosh, that's excellent. I just watched a Stooges where they thought they killed a guy, and they shot a mannequin and just assumed that they had murdered somebody and immediately went to hiding the body.
Yes. I know that film. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, that's the one where it's out in a pet cemetery and there's a guy dressed like the devil. It was a really crazy one. But I thought, what are the morals of these Stooges? I mean, they didn't even think about turning themselves in.
No, they're true anarchists, I'd say, the Stooges. because that's part of what becomes so interesting. And the more I looked at them, you see, the more I found them interesting. And they seem to have the strangest career of any, Hollywood comedy team in history, because of course the personnel keeps changing,
Yes.
And it takes us right back to Ed Wood and fake Shemps, basically, fake Bella.
That's right. That's right, because I was surprised to find out even later that Mo replaced Larry later on. You were used to the Curly and the Shemp and the Curly Joe and those replacements, but Larry?
Oh, no,
Mo just kept that stooge train going.
That's right.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited about that.
Well, so I got one. I made one sale already, so I can get happy man.
The whole show's been worth it.
Absolutely.
Well, Ramsey, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. I'm still reeling. I didn't know that you knew Robert Aikman. I'm just flabbergasted by that.
I know all those guys. Yes, I have their essential salts here on my desk.
Oh, my goodness.
But thank you so much for taking the time. I love your work. I am a huge fan, and I don't get to say that very often to people. It's an honor to have you on the show.
Gentlemen, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Folks, we're going to be back next week with Brenda by Margaret St. Clair, and then we'll be doing The Bus by Shirley Jackson. Also in the Folio Book of Horror Stories. We're going to link out to all these things in the show notes so that you can pick them up. That's all we have for now. I'm Chad Pfeiffer.
I'm Chris Lackey.
And I'm Ramsey Campbell. And I'm going to come and see you tonight in the dark.
So look forward to that, folks. Thanks for tuning in to hppodcraft.com.